What are some government programs that shocked you the most? Story 1, The Great Panjandrum, is one of World War II's most genuinely ridiculous military engineering projects. And what makes it specifically wonderful is the combination of earnest ambition with catastrophically consistent failure, and the existence of actual film footage documenting that failure in detail that no satirist could improve on. The device was developed by the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, itself a real organization worth knowing about, and consisted of two large wooden wheels, approximately 10 feet in diameter, connected by a central drum containing explosives. Cordite rockets were attached around the outer rim of each wheel. The concept: the rockets fire, the wheels spin, the device rolls off a landing craft at high speed, travels up the beach, hits the concrete seawall, and the central explosive charge detonates. The wall comes down. Allied troops advance. The testing, conducted on the beaches of Devon in the presence of senior naval officers and Churchill's representative, who had come to evaluate the weapon for potential use in the D-Day landings, went differently. In multiple film trials, the rockets fired unevenly, causing the wheels to veer off course. Rockets detached and began firing independently. The device spun unpredictably in multiple directions simultaneously. In the most famous trial sequence, the Panjandrum turned and charged at a group of observers, scattering admirals and dignitaries across the beach in what the film record shows was a genuinely undignified retreat. The project was canceled. The film footage was classified for decades, apparently because even in 1943, someone understood that sending the Secretary of the Navy running from a malfunctioning wheel was not the image that wartime communications required. Story 2, The Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, was a real British Admiralty department established during World War II, staffed with scientists, engineers, and what its own members sometimes called gentlemen amateurs, tasked with evaluating and developing unconventional weapons concepts that were too strange for conventional military research channels to consider seriously. Its members gave themselves the nickname the Wheezers and Dodgers, a piece of self-aware humor about their position in the military establishment. The implication being that they were old enough to have wheezed past the age for conventional service and eccentric enough to have dodged normal employment. The department reported to the Director of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a position held by Charles Godev, a Canadian naval officer and physical chemist whose genuine scientific credentials helped secure the department's access to resources and testing facilities that less credentialed eccentricity would not have obtained. The weapons concepts the DMWD evaluated included launching flaming ropes at low-flying aircraft to destroy their propellers, firing steel cables trailing explosive charges into the sky above British cities to snag enemy bombers, developing depth charges that could be fired from conventional Army mortar systems rather than naval equipment, and numerous other proposals that ranged from the operationally sound to the spectacularly impractical. The department's genuine successes included several weapons that made it into operational service and that are now forgotten precisely because they worked and were absorbed into the normal military inventory. The Great Panjandrum is remembered because it was spectacular. The effective weapons the Wheezers and Dodgers produced are historical footnotes. Story 3, Operation Mincemeat, is one of the most audacious and completely successful deception operations in the history of intelligence, and it worked because British intelligence correctly understood that an implausible story, if supported by convincing physical evidence, can overcome any amount of logical skepticism. The operation, executed in April 1943, involved the body of Glyndŵr Michael, a homeless Welshman who had died in London after ingesting rat poison, obtained from a London coroner with the cooperation of the coroner's office. British intelligence dressed the body in the uniform of a Royal Marine captain, created a complete false identity for him, Major William Martin, complete with personal letters, love notes, theater ticket stubs, a stern letter from his banker about an overdraft, and most critically, official-looking documents indicating that the Allied invasion of Sicily was a feint, and that the real landings would be in Greece and Sardinia. The body was floated off the coast of Spain from a submarine in an area where tides would carry it to shore in a region with known German intelligence connections. Spanish authorities recovered the body. The documents were examined by German agents who photographed them before returning them to the British, and within weeks, Adolf Hitler had personally ordered reinforcements to the Greek coast. When the Allies landed in Sicily in July 1943, they faced significantly reduced resistance because German command had moved resources based on the forged documents. The deception is now fully declassified and was the subject of a best-selling book by Ben McIntyre and multiple films. What remains astonishing is that it worked on the German High Command through approximately 1 month of planning and the body of a man who died in London of rat poisoning. Story 4, Project 1794, was a genuine, funded U.S. Air Force program to develop a circular supersonic aircraft, a literal flying saucer, that declassified documents from 2012 confirm was actively developed at Avro, Canada in the 1950s, with specific technical specifications for an aircraft capable of reaching Mach 4 and altitudes above 100,000 feet. The documents, released by the National Archives, include original blueprints, cost-benefit analyses, progress reports, and engineering assessments of the prototype vehicle known as the Avrocar and its more advanced proposed successor. The Avrocar itself is a confirmed physical reality. Several prototypes were built, tested, and are preserved in museums, including the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. The tested Avrocar proved significantly less capable than the project's ambitions, barely achieving 3 feet of altitude and relatively slow forward speeds due to the stability problems inherent in a circular wing platform at practical test conditions. The more ambitious supersonic specifications described in the 1794 project documents, Mach 4 top speed, 100,000-foot service ceiling, 1,000-mile range, were never realized before the program was canceled. Whether this was because the physics of the circular wing proved intractable for high-performance applications, because the parallel development of more conventional high-performance aircraft, like the SR-71, made the flying saucer concept unnecessary, or because the stability problems identified in Avrocar testing were judged unresolvable, the program ended without delivering the supersonic saucer the documents specify. The implication that civilian UFO sightings of the 1950s may have included test flights of genuinely unconventional aircraft, saucer-shaped and American rather than extraterrestrial, is one the CIA's own historical documents have explicitly acknowledged. Story 5 Operation Gold was a joint CIA-MI6 intelligence operation that, in pure tactical execution, represented a remarkable achievement of Cold War espionage engineering. A 1,476-foot tunnel dug from the American sector of West Berlin, under the Berlin Wall, to a point beneath Soviet military communication cables that the tunnel team then tapped for approximately 11 months, intercepting thousands of Soviet military communications. The tunnel was dug between 1954 and 1955 at a cost of approximately $6 million, using sophisticated sound dampening techniques to conceal the digging from Soviet sensors on the other side. The tap itself operated from May 1955 until April 1956, when Soviet forces apparently discovered it during routine cable maintenance, making a show of the discovery that generated significant international coverage. The irony that makes Operation Gold one of intelligence history's great tragedies: the Soviets had known about the tunnel before a single cubic foot of soil was removed. George Blake, a British intelligence officer who had participated in the planning meeting at which Operation Gold was designed, was a Soviet agent. He reported the tunnel's existence to his KGB handler almost immediately after the planning meeting in which he learned of it. The KGB knew about the tunnel, knew where it was, knew what communications it was intercepting, and made the decision not to reveal the compromise, because doing so would have exposed Blake, their source inside MI6, whose ongoing intelligence value exceeded the value of ending the tunnel operation. The Soviets let the tape run for 11 months, accepting the intelligence loss of those intercepted communications as the cost of protecting an agent who continued providing valuable intelligence for several more years until he was caught in 1961. Story 6 Project X-Ray, sometimes called the Bat Bomb Project, is one of the more genuinely creative military concepts of World War II, and it had a specific logic to it that makes it considerably less absurd than the headline description implies, even though the headline description is entirely accurate. The concept originated with a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle Adams, who proposed it to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1941, and who correctly identified a specific vulnerability in the urban structure of Japanese cities: timber construction. Japanese cities of the era had significantly higher proportions of wooden buildings than American or European cities, making them genuinely vulnerable to incendiary attack in ways that concrete, heavy Western urban centers were not. Adams's proposal exploited the natural behavior of bats, their tendency to seek roosts in enclosed spaces, attics, and ceiling voids, to distribute tiny incendiary devices throughout a target city's structures in locations inaccessible to conventional fire control. The project received serious military attention, was approved by Franklin Roosevelt, and consumed approximately $2 million in development funding. Tests using Mexican free-tailed bats from caves in Texas produced the accidental incineration noted in this entry. Bats carrying armed incendiary devices escaped before the test was complete, roosted in structures at the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary in New Mexico, and burned down a general's car and a hangar. The project was canceled in 1944 when the Manhattan Project's timeline made the atomic bombing program the clear priority for strategic bombing of Japan. Whether bat bombs would have been effective is a question that was resolved by the selection of a different, considerably more destructive alternative. Story 7 PM-3A, nicknamed Nuki Poo by the personnel who operated it, was a small pressurized water nuclear reactor installed at McMurdo Station, the U.S. Antarctic Research Base, in 1962 by the U.S. Army. Its purpose was to provide electrical power and heat to the station without the continuous, expensive, logistically challenging resupply of diesel fuel that the station's conventional generators required. The concept was sound. Antarctica's isolation and the difficulty of maintaining fuel supply made the idea of a self-sufficient nuclear power source attractive. The execution was considerably less sound. The reactor experienced numerous malfunctions over its 10-year operating life, including coolant leaks that released radioactive steam into the environment, several automatic shutdowns from equipment failures, and management challenges that would have been considered unacceptable at any civilian nuclear installation operating under normal regulatory oversight. Antarctica was not covered by the regulatory frameworks that governed nuclear operations in the continental United States, and the oversight structures at McMurdo reflected this gap. The decommissioning process that began in 1972 produced numbers that capture the reactor's operational legacy more vividly than any technical description. Approximately 101 truckloads of contaminated soil, rock, and equipment were transported from Antarctica to a nuclear waste disposal site in South Carolina. The contamination footprint required excavating significant quantities of Antarctic earth to reach acceptable background radiation levels at the site. The project's legacy is mixed in the specific way that Antarctic Cold War engineering often is. The logistical ambition was genuine, and the underlying concept was reasonable. But the execution reflected the era's combination of enthusiasm for nuclear technology and limited understanding of the operational and environmental challenges of managing a reactor system in one of the most remote and extreme environments on Earth. Story 8, The History of Soviet Military and Industrial Engineering in the Interwar Period, contains numerous projects that strain the boundary between visionary and preposterous, and the amphibious train concept sits comfortably in that specific zone. A railway vehicle capable of traveling on conventional rail tracks and then detaching to cross rivers and waterways under its own power. The practical military problem the design addressed was genuine, Soviet territory included numerous river systems that could interrupt rail supply lines, and bridging those rivers under wartime conditions was both time-consuming and exposed to enemy interference. A rail vehicle that could continue its journey across a river without requiring a bridge would have genuine operational advantages in the specific logistical environment of the Soviet Union. The engineering solutions proposed, and in some accounts partially prototyped, involved replacing conventional steel wheels with systems capable of functioning on both rail and water. Options including large inflatable flotation devices, rubberized track sections with some buoyancy, and configurations that allowed the vehicle to transition from rail to river transit without disembarking cargo or personnel. Whether a fully functional prototype was completed and tested at the level described in this entry, with rubber tracks and inflatable wheels crossing actual rivers, or whether the concept remained at the design and partial prototype stage, is not definitively established in available English language sources. Soviet interwar engineering produced enough genuinely bizarre prototypes that the concept is plausible and the strategic logic is sound. The complexity of a reliable rail-to-water transition mechanism and the limited usefulness of a very specialized vehicle in a military inventory that required simplicity and standardization at scale are the factors most consistent with why this concept never reached production. Story 9. This entry sits in the category of Cold War military rumor rather than confirmed, declassified program, and it's worth being clear about that distinction. The concept of using volcanic geological features to conceal electronic installations from Western surveillance is strategically logical, but the specific project screen designation and the program as described here doesn't appear in confirmed declassified documentation from either Soviet or Western sources. The underlying strategic logic is real. Volcanic rock has specific thermal and electromagnetic properties that differ from standard geological formations, and the natural heat signature of volcanically active areas creates genuine challenges for certain types of remote sensing and radar detection. The Soviet military invested heavily throughout the Cold War in techniques for concealing facilities and electronics from Western intelligence collection, including both satellite imagery and electronic intelligence gathering. The specific challenge of concealing early warning radar systems from Western targeting was a genuine priority. Soviet facilities were established in the Kamchatka Peninsula and Kuril Islands region, which is volcanically active, and it's possible that specific facility placement took advantage of geological features for some degree of natural shielding. Whether any program was explicitly designed around using active volcanic craters as containment structures for radar electronics, with the specific theory that volcanic heat signatures would mask electronic signatures, is something the available documentation doesn't confirm. The concept is interesting enough that it circulates in discussions of Cold War unusual weapons and engineering, and the volcanic geology rationale has enough surface plausibility to make the claim feel credible. Without confirmed documentation, it remains a compelling claimed program rather than a confirmed one. Story 10. The Echronoplan is real, documented, physically enormous, and represents one of the more genuinely fascinating engineering concepts of the Cold War. A vehicle category that exploited a specific aerodynamic phenomenon in ways that produced performance characteristics unlike anything else that was operating on the water or in the air. The ground effect that echronoplans exploit is a real aerodynamic phenomenon. A wing flying very close to a surface, typically within one wingspan's height, generates significantly more lift and less induced drag than the same wing at altitude, because the surface disrupts the airflow pattern that normally allows air to escape from beneath the wing. The closer to the surface, the stronger the effect. An echronoplan is specifically designed to cruise at very low altitude, typically between 2 and 10 meters above the water, where this ground effect provides lift efficiency far exceeding what is achievable in conventional flight. The KM echronoplan, the Caspian Sea Monster, as it became known to Western analysts, who first identified it in satellite imagery and were baffled by what they were looking at, was a full-scale operational prototype of approximately 550 tons displacement, 100 meters in length, powered by 10 turbojet engines, capable of speeds approaching 500 km/h and operating at altitudes that made it effectively invisible to the radar systems of the period, which were calibrated for targets higher than 10 meters above the surface. The vehicle flew, or sailed, or something in between, for approximately 15 years before crashing in 1980 due to pilot error. The Soviets built several smaller operational ekranoplanes, some of which carried anti-ship missile systems, and the concept has been periodically revived by various militaries. It was not a classified program by the end of the Cold War. It was simply a very strange category of vehicle that the world largely forgot about. Story 11 Soviet weather modification programs were real, conducted at scale, and the specific application described here, using artillery and aircraft to seed clouds with silver iodide before important state events to force rainfall to occur before the clouds reached Moscow, is one of the more thoroughly documented applications of cloud seeding technology for non-agricultural purposes. Cloud seeding works by introducing particles that act as condensation nuclei into clouds, causing water vapor to condense and fall as precipitation sooner than it would otherwise. Silver iodide has a crystal structure similar enough to ice that water vapor in clouds preferentially condenses on it, making it the standard cloud seeding agent. The technology has been used for agricultural purposes, attempting to increase rainfall in dry areas since the 1940s, when Vincent Schaefer and Bernard Vonnegut developed the basic technique at General Electric. The Soviet application described here is the inversion of the standard agricultural use. Rather than seeding clouds to produce more rainfall, the goal was to exhaust the cloud's moisture content before they reached the target area, ensuring that Moscow's major military parades, Red Square celebrations, and significant state events occurred under clear skies rather than rain. Rainfall on the Victory Day Parade, or the October Revolution anniversary, would have been a significant symbolic problem for an authoritarian government with a strong interest in controlling the presentation of state power. The practice is confirmed in Russian sources and has been continued by the Russian government after the Soviet Union's dissolution, with similar operations documented around major events in the post-Soviet period. It is one of the more mundane of the Soviet weather modification programs. The ambitions for agricultural applications were considerably more dramatic, but also the one with the clearest documented operational history. Story 12 The Zato System. Zakrytoye Administrativno-Territorialnoye Obrazovanaye, or Closed Administrative Territorial Formation, was a network of entire cities and towns that the Soviet government removed from public maps, replaced on official documents with numerical designations rather than names, and physically isolated from the general Soviet population through controlled access, perimeter fencing, and internal security systems. These were not small installations. The closed cities of the Soviet nuclear and military research complex included cities with populations in the tens of thousands, complete with schools, hospitals, cultural facilities, shops, and all the infrastructure of normal urban life, simply existing outside the publicly acknowledged geography of the Soviet Union. Residents held identification documents that listed an address like Chelyabinsk 40 or Krasnoyarsk 26, addresses that corresponded to no publicly acknowledged location, and that told anyone examining the documents exactly what category of work their holder was involved in, while revealing nothing about where they actually lived. The cities housed the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons design bureaus, weapons-grade fissile material production facilities, submarine construction yards, biological and chemical weapons research institutes, and other military-industrial facilities too sensitive to exist in the public sphere. The decision to construct entirely new urban settlements rather than simply classify existing towns reflected both security priorities and the Soviet preference for constructing purpose-built facilities rather than adapting existing infrastructure. Some of these cities remained classified well into the post-Soviet period, their existence awkward to acknowledge because it required confronting the full scope of the Soviet military-industrial legacy. Others have been partially opened and have shed their numerical designations, though the community's histories as literally off-the-map locations remain distinctive. Story 13, Operation Vegetarian. Britain built 5 million anthrax cattle cakes and never used them. Operation Vegetarian is one of the more specific and carefully documented examples of World War II biological warfare planning. And what makes it particularly striking is how far the program progressed before it was terminated. Not at the concept stage, not at the prototype stage, but to the point of full-scale production of the intended weapon, ready for deployment. The operational concept was direct and agricultural. Cattle are essential to a nation's food supply, particularly in wartime when protein resources are constrained. If the cattle of the enemy nation could be killed, the resulting food supply disruption would compound other wartime pressures on the civilian population and the war economy. Anthrax, a soil-borne bacterium that is highly lethal to cattle and can persist in soil for decades, was the selected agent. The delivery mechanism was linseed oil cakes, a standard livestock supplement that cattle would consume without any particular encouragement. Production of the anthrax-laced cakes was completed. Approximately 5 million individual cake units were manufactured at the Portondown Biological Weapons Establishment, stored and ready for air delivery over German and potentially Danish agricultural land. The delivery was planned for 1944 if the strategic situation required it. The strategic situation did not require it. The Allied military position improved to the point where the biological campaign was judged unnecessary, and the program was terminated. The 5 million anthrax cattle cakes were incinerated in 1945. The testing associated with the program, conducted on Gruinard Island off the Scottish coast, contaminated the island's soil with anthrax spores to such a degree that the island was quarantined for approximately 48 years. It was formally declared safe after an intensive decontamination program in 1990. Story 14, Britain's rocket sleds. Testing ejection seats at speeds that made mannequins unrecognizable. The development of ejection seats for high-performance aircraft required understanding what the human body can survive at extreme velocities and acceleration loads, knowledge that could not be obtained purely through calculation and that required physical testing. The rocket sled programs developed by Britain and the United States in the post-war period were the primary mechanism for acquiring this knowledge under controlled, ground-level conditions. A rocket sled is exactly what the description suggests: a frame mounted on a track, accelerated by rocket motors to very high speeds over a short distance, and stopped abruptly or gradually depending on what the test requires. The sled can carry instrumented test subjects, including anthropomorphic dummies, cadavers selected and prepared for structural testing, and in some cases human volunteers, while sensors measure the forces experienced at each stage of the acceleration and deceleration profile. The British rocket sled program at Ray Farnborough and associated establishments supported the development of ejection seat technology for the RAF's jet aircraft fleet, providing data on the structural loads associated with ejection at various speeds and altitudes that allowed seat designers to engineer systems capable of reliably saving aircrew in the speed regimes that jet fighters were entering. The use of cadavers in this category of testing, while ethically complex by contemporary standards, was and remains a genuine method for obtaining structural failure data in physical testing scenarios where the behavior of biological tissue is directly relevant to the engineering question and where no synthetic substitute reliably replicates the failure characteristics being studied. The programs were not conducted secretly in the sense of concealing the research. The use of cadavers in impact research was simply not a widely discussed aspect of military engineering. Story 15, Project Zircon. The British spy satellite hidden from Parliament and the BBC raid when it was found. Project Zircon was a British intelligence signals intelligence satellite program of the 1980s that was classified at a level that excluded it from the normal parliamentary budget oversight process, kept secret not merely from the general public, but from most members of Parliament. including members of the Defense Select Committee who would normally have oversight responsibility for programs of this scale. The political sensitivity of the program was therefore not simply that it was classified, but that its classification had been used to circumvent parliamentary oversight of government expenditure, a constitutionally significant issue in a system where Parliament's control of the public purse is a foundational principle. The program's estimated cost was approximately $500 million, a figure that, removed from parliamentary budget scrutiny, represented a significant constitutional irregularity. In 1987, journalist Duncan Campbell produced a documentary for the BBC's Secret Society series, specifically investigating Project Zircon and the parliamentary oversight issue. The British government's response was extraordinary in its own right. Before the documentary could be broadcast, special branch officers raided the BBC's offices in Glasgow, seizing film and documents related to the program. Simultaneously, Campbell's own home was searched. The documentary was not broadcast in the United Kingdom for several years. The case became a significant point in British debates about state secrecy, press freedom, and the limits of classification. Questions about whether a government could properly use national security classification to conceal information not from foreign adversaries, but from its own elected representatives. The satellite program's existence was subsequently acknowledged officially, though many details of its specific capabilities remained classified. Story 16, Blue Peacock. Britain's nuclear landmine was going to be kept warm by live chickens. The Blue Peacock was a British nuclear landmine project of the 1950s, intended to produce a weapon that could be buried in West Germany ahead of a potential Soviet advance and detonated remotely to deny terrain, destroy enemy forces, and create a zone of radioactive contamination that would complicate any Soviet breakthrough into Western Europe. The basic concept was straightforward enough by Cold War standards. Tactical nuclear denial weapons were a genuine component of NATO's defensive strategy during the period when conventional force numbers significantly favored the Warsaw Pact. The specific technical problem that generated the chicken solution was genuinely peculiar. A nuclear weapon requires its electronic components, including the arming and firing circuits, to be maintained within temperature ranges compatible with reliable operation. A landmine buried in the German winter in soil that could freeze to significant depths during the winter months would expose these components to temperatures that could render them unreliable or non-functional at exactly the moment they were needed. The engineering challenge was keeping the electronics warm during the months a buried weapon might sit before detonation. The solution proposed by British weapons engineers, documented in files declassified by the British National Archives in 2004, was to seal live chickens inside the mine casing, along with sufficient chicken feed to keep them alive for approximately a week. The chicken's body heat, sealed within the insulated mine casing, would maintain the electronics at operational temperature. The chickens would die, but the mine would remain functional. The proposal was assessed seriously. The Blue Peacock project was ultimately canceled in 1958 for strategic rather than livestock welfare reasons, and the chicken heating solution was never deployed. It was not an April Fool joke, despite being released on April 1st. Story 17, Project Ice Cube. Temporary military bunkers made entirely from ice. The use of ice and compacted snow as structural materials for military purposes has a longer history than most people realize. Rooted in the specific engineering properties of ice at the temperatures prevailing in high-latitude winter environments, ice under compression can achieve structural strengths comparable to concrete at very low temperatures, and it is available at effectively zero cost in environments where construction materials must otherwise be transported at enormous logistical expense. The specific concept being described here, reinforced ice construction for military bunkers, storage facilities, and defensive positions, builds on real engineering work that predates and postdates the Cold War. The most famous wartime proposal for exploiting ice's structural properties was Project Habakkuk, a British Second World War concept for building aircraft carriers from a composite of ice and wood pulp called picrete. which is substantially stronger and slower melting than ordinary ice. Pykrete prototype testing demonstrated the material's genuine engineering potential. Cold War military research into ice construction for Arctic environments was a real activity, driven by the genuine military interest both superpowers had in operating in polar regions and the specific challenges of constructing facilities in environments where conventional materials must be flown or shipped at great cost. The U.S. Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory conducted extensive work on snow and ice construction properties throughout the Cold War period. Whether a program specifically designated Project Ice Cube with the specific design parameters described existed as a named program is less certain than the general category of Arctic ice construction research. The research itself is documented. The specific project name and parameters are the uncertain element. Story 18, Operation Sea Spray. The U.S. Navy secretly sprayed San Francisco with bacteria to study the spread. Operation Sea Spray is one of the more thoroughly documented examples of U.S. military biological testing on unknowing civilian populations, confirmed through congressional investigations, released government documents, and legal proceedings that establish the basic facts of the operation. In September 1950, the U.S. Navy conducted a series of covert tests off the coast of San Francisco, using boats and shipboard equipment to spray two bacterial agents, primarily Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, as aerosols over the San Francisco Bay Area and the city itself. The specific bacteria were selected because they were believed at the time to be harmless to humans, and because Serratia marcescens produces a distinctive red pigment that made tracking the bacteria's dispersal through the environment straightforward. The tests confirmed the military's ability to covertly expose a large urban population to an aerosolized biological agent, a demonstration of vulnerability that was relevant to Cold War planning about what an adversary might do to American cities through covert biological attack. The assessment that Serratia marcescens was harmless to humans proved incorrect in at least one confirmed way. In the weeks following the test, a San Francisco hospital treated an unusual cluster of patients infected with Serratia marcescens urinary tract infections, an uncommon pathogen at the time that had not previously appeared in the hospital's clinical record. At least one patient died. Whether this cluster was directly caused by the sea spray aerosol or by coincidence has been legally contested, but the timing is specific. The operation remained unknown to the public until a 1977 Senate investigation into biological testing conducted a broad review of such programs and brought sea spray into the public record. Story 19, Project Chariot. The plan to nuke Alaska to build a harbor. Project Chariot was part of a broader Atomic Energy Commission initiative called Operation Plowshare, which was genuinely and earnestly premised on finding peaceful civilian uses for thermonuclear explosions. The underlying logic: nuclear explosions release enormous amounts of energy very quickly, and if that energy could be directed constructively, excavating canals, creating harbors, moving mountains of rock in mining operations, the technology that had been used to destroy cities could instead be used to reshape geography at scales and speeds no conventional engineering could match. Project Chariot was the specific proposal to demonstrate this concept in Alaska, with a plan to detonate 5 thermonuclear bombs at Cape Thompson, 1 larger device and 4 smaller ones, in a specific geometric arrangement designed to excavate an instant deep water harbor. The total yield was approximately 2.4 megatons. The result would be a harbor that the EC argued would support commercial shipping, resource development, and the Alaskan economy. The problem was that the AK had not adequately consulted the indigenous Inupiat communities who lived in the region and who depended on the local ecosystem, particularly the caribou herds, the fish, and the sea mammals of the area, for their subsistence. When the proposal became public and Inupiat leaders understood what was being planned for their territory, the opposition was organized and sustained. Community members collected signatures, engaged journalists, and persistently communicated with AEC representatives and government officials. The project was canceled in 1962. It is generally cited as an early and significant example of indigenous communities successfully opposing a major federal project, predating many of the environmental and indigenous rights frameworks that would later formalize this kind of advocacy. Story 20, The Lazy Dog. Planes dropping thousands of steel darts with no explosives required. The Lazy Dog was a kinetic anti-personnel weapon developed for use in the Korean War and subsequently deployed in Vietnam, one of the more straightforwardly lethal minimalist weapon concepts in modern military history, because it exploited the most fundamental physics available to any airborne weapon: gravity and the velocity that gravity produces. Each Lazy Dog projectile was a small steel dart, approximately 2 inches long, finned at the rear to ensure stable nose-first orientation during descent, sharp at the front, and heavy enough relative to its cross-section to maintain terminal velocity throughout the drop. They contain no explosive filling, no fusing system, no chemical payload. They were solid steel pins that were dropped in large quantities from aircraft and fell under gravity to achieve a terminal velocity of several hundred feet per second. At that velocity, the kinetic energy of a 2-inch steel dart penetrating a human body is sufficient to cause death or serious injury. The weapon required no triggering mechanism because there was nothing to trigger. The impact itself was the entirety of the effect. Canisters holding large numbers of projectiles would be released from aircraft over target areas and disperse across a considerable ground footprint during descent. The weapon's appeal to military planners was its simplicity and cost. No explosives, no fusing, no sophisticated manufacturing, no hazard during storage or transport, and very high anti-personnel effectiveness per unit of weight delivered by aircraft. Its documented use raised significant humanitarian concerns about the difficulty of distinguishing civilian and military personnel in the blast radius, or more precisely, the drop radius, of a weapon designed to be effective over a wide dispersal area. Story 21, Project A119. The U.S. Air Force wanted to nuke the moon to win the space race. Project A119, formerly titled A Study of Lunar Research Flights, was a classified U.S. Air Force study commissioned in 1958 at the height of the space race anxiety following Sputnik, with the explicit goal of evaluating the feasibility and potential impact of detonating a nuclear device on the moon's surface. The strategic motivation was direct and acknowledged within the study itself. The United States had been visibly losing the early phases of the space race, and a nuclear detonation on the moon, visible to the naked eye from Earth as a bright flash against the lunar surface, would demonstrate American technological capability in the most dramatic possible terms. The shock value of watching a nuclear explosion on the moon, readable from any country on Earth without any special equipment, was the primary strategic objective, rather than any scientific or military effect the explosion itself might produce. The study was conducted by a team that included Carl Sagan, then a young graduate student who was later famous as the host of Cosmos and an advocate for peaceful uses of space. Sagan contributed analysis of the potential for contamination of the lunar surface from the explosion and the implications for future scientific study of the moon. He reportedly disclosed his participation in the study on a fellowship application, which eventually brought the program's existence to public attention decades later. The project was ultimately not pursued, with the decision attributed to concerns about public reaction to placing nuclear weapons in space, the risk of a failed launch depositing nuclear material in Earth's atmosphere, and the assessment that a successful moon landing, which was becoming the primary U.S. space race objective, would be a more durable demonstration of capability than a nuclear explosion. Story 22. The Soviet Trench Digger. A machine that could slice open the Earth at walking speed. The Etcher series of Soviet military trench digging machines, the specific type this entry describes, represents a category of engineering that the Soviet military invested in during the Cold War era for reasons directly connected to their strategic doctrine. The expectation that a conflict in Central Europe would require rapid construction of defensive field fortifications over very large areas at speeds that manual digging with entrenching tools could not approach. The fundamental engineering challenge of a mechanized trench digger is removing earth quickly and continuously from a channel of specific dimensions while the machine moves forward. The Soviet approach used continuous excavation with large rotating cutting chains equipped with digging paddles, similar in concept to a very large, very powerful chain saw designed to cut through soil rather than wood, combined with conveyor belts to throw the excavated material to the side of the advancing machine. The resulting trench dimensions, width, depth, and profile could be specified by the machine's design and remained consistent as the machine advanced, producing field fortifications to a standardized profile across whatever terrain the machine encountered at a rate of advance measured in meters per minute rather than meters per hour. The speed and consistency that mechanized trench digging provides translates directly into tactical utility. Infantry can follow immediately behind the machine into completed cover, rather than requiring a construction period during which they are exposed. The limitation, as with most large, specialized military engineering vehicles, is the balance between capability and the logistical and operational burden of maintaining and deploying machines that require specialist crews and support equipment. Story 23: The Aerosani. Aircraft engine-powered sleds that crossed frozen Russia at 100 mph. The Aerosani. The term is essentially a portmanteau of aerial and sled, is a propeller-driven surface vehicle mounted on skis rather than wheels or tracks, powered by aircraft engines, and designed specifically for operation on snow and ice surfaces where the drag of conventional tracked vehicles is high, and the wheel efficiency of wheeled vehicles drops to near zero. The concept exploits a specific property of snow and ice surfaces at cold temperatures. Their coefficient of friction is extraordinarily low for a ski gliding across them, much lower than for any comparable rubber or metal surface on soil or road. A well-designed ski vehicle with sufficient propulsive power can achieve speeds on frozen surfaces that tracked or wheeled vehicles of comparable power cannot match, because the propulsion system, the aircraft propeller pushing against air, rather than the vehicle's contact surface pushing against the ground, is not limited by traction in the way that driven wheels or tracks are. Soviet military Aerosani were used extensively during World War II, particularly during the Winter War with Finland and in the early phases of the Eastern Front, where the extreme winter conditions of 1941-42 created terrain conditions where few conventional vehicles could operate. They provided the Soviet military with a mobility option in deep snow and across frozen lakes and rivers that was unavailable to German forces operating primarily with wheeled and tracked equipment designed for European rather than extreme winter conditions. The vehicles were typically armed with machine guns and used for reconnaissance, courier duties, and rapid flanking movements across terrain that other forces couldn't cross, a tactical capability the extreme Russian winter uniquely provided to forces equipped to exploit it. Story 24: Object 279. The Soviet nuclear-proof tank, shaped like a flying saucer, Object 279, is one of the most visually distinctive military vehicles ever built, and its distinctive appearance was the direct product of a specific engineering requirement: survive a nuclear explosion in the field. The prototype, built in 1959 at the Kirov factory in Leningrad, addressed a genuine tactical problem that emerged from Cold War nuclear doctrine. If tactical nuclear weapons were going to be used on the battlefield, and Soviet and NATO doctrine of the period both anticipated this, then heavy tanks needed to be capable of continuing to function in the immediate aftermath of a near-miss nuclear detonation. The primary killing mechanism for a tank at the margins of a nuclear blast radius isn't the heat or radiation directly, but the shock wave, the sudden, extreme overpressure wave that radiates from the detonation point and can flip, crush, and overturn vehicles at considerable distances from the explosion itself. The Object 279's hull was designed to deflect rather than resist this shock wave, The characteristic elliptical lenticular shape, wide, flat, and rounded in cross-section, with no flat vertical surfaces for pressure to act against, was specifically intended to allow the overpressure wave to flow around the hull rather than striking a perpendicular surface and transmitting maximum force to the vehicle. The hull shape derived directly from hydrodynamic and aerodynamic research on how shock waves interact with different geometric forms. The vehicle additionally ran on 4 independent track systems rather than 2, distributing its weight to allow crossing very soft terrain and providing redundancy if one track system was damaged. It mounted a 130 mm gun in a well-armed heavy tank configuration. Nikita Khrushchev canceled the project in 1960 as part of a broader decision that heavy tank development was less important than missile systems. Story 25: The Soviet Nuclear Mole. The underground drilling vehicle that may or may not have existed the Soviet subterrane, sometimes called the nuclear mole or battle mole in the various accounts that circulate about it, is one of the more tantalizing entries in the Cold War unusual weapons category because it combines a concept with genuine physical plausibility. Soviet engineering ambition that is independently documented in other contexts, and a documented American equivalent program, while the Soviet version itself remains in the category of rumored rather than confirmed. The concept of using a nuclear reactor to power a drilling vehicle that melts rather than mechanically cuts through rock is physically sound. Drilling through rock by heating it to its melting point requires enormous energy input, but avoids the mechanical wear and fracture that limits conventional drill bits. A vehicle powered by a nuclear reactor, which provides sustained energy at high density in a form that doesn't require continuous fuel resupply from the surface, could in principle sustain the temperatures needed for thermal drilling through rock. The resulting vehicle would advance slowly, but could do so silently and without the physical evidence of surface disturbance that conventional drilling produces. The United States developed a thermal drilling device using nuclear heating at Los Alamos National Laboratory, the subterranean, during the 1970s, and patents for the concept exist in the American Patent Database. This confirms that the technical concept was taken seriously enough by American weapons researchers to invest in prototype development. Whether the Soviets pursued a parallel program is suggested by defector accounts and intelligence analyses, but has not been confirmed by documentation from Russian archives or from the declassified American intelligence record. The concept is real, the American version is documented, and the Soviet version is a plausible inference from Soviet engineering patterns that lacks confirming documentation. Story 26: The Kola Superdeep Borehole. They drilled into the earth for 24 years and found something that shouldn't be there. The Kola Superdeep Borehole, drilled by Soviet scientists on the Kola Peninsula in northwestern Russia, beginning in 1970, and continuing until the project was halted in 1994 due to funding loss after the Soviet Union's collapse, reached a depth of 12,262 meters, making it the deepest artificial point ever created in the Earth's crust, a record it holds to this day. The scientific motivation was genuine and ambitious, understanding the composition and conditions of the deep crust through direct sampling and measurement, rather than the indirect inference that surface geology and seismic data require. The project was the Soviet equivalent of America's Mohole project, which had attempted similar deep ocean drilling before being canceled on cost grounds in 1966. What the Kola borehole found at depth was genuinely surprising in several respects. The geological models that had predicted what rock types would be encountered at various depths were significantly wrong. The basalt layer that models expected to find below approximately 7 kilometers was not where the models placed it, and the rock at depth was far more fractured and water-saturated than models predicted. Liquid water actually present in the rock through microscopic fractures at depths where the pressure and temperature conditions had been expected to preclude any liquid water. The discovery of water at such depths has significant implications for our understanding of the deep rock cycle and for the possibility of life in deep rock systems. At 12 kilometers, the temperature was approximately 180 C, hotter than models had predicted, and hot enough that the drill pipe and bits began to behave plastically rather than rigidly, making further drilling impractical. The Earth's interior was hotter than anyone had calculated it would be at that depth. The models were wrong. Story 27, Project Habakkuk. Britain's plan to build an aircraft carrier from frozen wood pulp, Project Habakkuk. The name taken from the biblical prophet and deliberately misspelled as a security measure, was a genuine Second World War British proposal to construct aircraft carriers from pykrete, a composite material of approximately 14% wood pulp mixed with water and frozen, which has structural properties significantly superior to ordinary ice. The proposal originated with Geoffrey Pike, a British inventor and government scientific advisor whose eccentricity was matched by genuine creativity. The strategic problem pykrete was intended to solve was the mid-Atlantic gap. Allied aircraft, based in Britain, couldn't cover the central Atlantic, where German submarines were inflicting catastrophic losses on supply convoys, and conventional aircraft carriers were both scarce and vulnerable to submarine attack themselves. A vessel made from a material available in nearly unlimited quantities, water and wood pulp, that could be repaired with onboard equipment, that was almost neutrally buoyant, and that was extremely resistant to torpedoes, seemed to offer an alternative to steel construction. The Habakkuk design proposed a vessel approximately 600 meters long and 90 meters wide, with refrigeration machinery to prevent the pykrete hull from melting, and capable of carrying 150 aircraft. A prototype section was built in a Canadian mountain lake, Patricia Lake in Alberta, where the cold climate reduced refrigeration requirements and the remote location maintained security. The prototype demonstrated that pykrete construction was feasible. The project was eventually canceled when developments in conventional carrier construction, long-range aircraft, and the strategic situation made the original problem less acute than it had been in 1942. The Patricia Lake prototype melted into the lake bottom, where its remains were discovered by divers decades later. Story 28, Operation Ramrod. Britain built entire fake airfields and fooled the Luftwaffe completely. The British deception program that created fake military infrastructure during World War II, collectively known under various operation names, including elements of the broader deception effort Operation Bodyguard, was one of the most extensive and creative applications of theatrical technique too. Military purpose in the history of warfare and its fake airfields were among its more practically successful components. The concept of a dummy airfield exploits a specific characteristic of aerial reconnaissance, which was the primary intelligence collection method of the period. Photographs taken from altitude and distance don't allow a pilot or analyst to walk up and knock on something to check if it's real. A wooden aircraft painted in appropriate camouflage colors and placed in a convincing dispersal pattern, photographed from 10,000 feet, looks like an aircraft. A canvas hangar with inflated internal structure, photographed from the air, looks like a hangar. British deception units produced canvas aircraft, wooden hangars, fake anti-aircraft gun positions equipped with flash devices to mimic the visual signature of firing, and fake runway lighting systems, all constructed with enough visual fidelity to pass aerial reconnaissance and to attract Luftwaffe bombing raids that would otherwise have targeted real installations. The resource efficiency of this approach is significant. A wooden aircraft costs a small fraction of the real aircraft it imitates, requires none of the maintenance or crew the real aircraft demands, and absorbs Luftwaffe bombing missions and munitions in a way that benefits the real aircraft and installations nearby. The Germans eventually developed enough analytical sophistication to distinguish real installations from fake ones in reconnaissance photographs, but the deception effort consumed significant Luftwaffe resources and analytical effort in the process. Story 29, The Acoustic Weapon. They built giant horns to make enemy soldiers sick with sound research into acoustic and sonic weapons, devices that use sound pressure or specific frequency ranges to produce physiological or psychological effects in human targets without conventional explosive or kinetic mechanisms, has a genuine history in military research from the Second World War period onward. And the specific concept described here has enough documented analogs to be credible even where the specific program is not fully confirmed. The physical mechanism underlying this research is real. Very low-frequency sound waves, infrasound, typically below 20 Hz, can interact with the resonant frequencies of human organs and cavities in ways that produce physical effects. The human body contains enclosed spaces, sinuses, chest cavity, abdomen with resonant frequencies in the infrasound range, and sound at sufficient intensity and appropriate frequency can produce physical disorientation, nausea, and discomfort. The research literature on infrasound and human physiology documents these effects. The engineering challenge for a weaponized infrasound system is the relationship between frequency, wavelength, and practical emitter size. The wavelength of effective infrasound is measured in tens of meters, requiring emitters of proportional size to produce efficient coupling between the sound source and the medium. This is the weight and transportability problem this entry identifies. A horn large enough to efficiently emit weaponized infrasound at the frequencies of interest is not a system that moves easily. Several governments, including Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, are documented to have conducted research into acoustic effects on human physiology with military applications in mind. Whether this specific program produced the specific hardware described is a question the available documentation doesn't fully resolve. Story 30 Project Pluto, the nuclear ramjet cruise missile that would have poisoned everything it flew over Project Pluto, was a real, funded, seriously pursued U.S. military program from 1957 to 1964 that developed a nuclear-powered ramjet engine, the Tory, intended to power a low-altitude cruise missile capable of sustained supersonic flight across intercontinental distances. The concept exploited a specific property of nuclear reactors. They produce heat continuously, without consuming fuel in the conventional sense, requiring only the original fissile material charge to sustain operation indefinitely. A ramjet engine uses incoming air as both the working fluid and the oxidizer, compressing it, heating it to produce thrust, and exhausting it rearward. A nuclear-heated ramjet could, in principle, sustain operation at Mach 3 for as long as the reactor ran, crossing continents and dispersing nuclear warheads across multiple targets before exhausting the aircraft's destructive capacity. The engineers at Lawrence Livermore who developed the Tory actually ran the engine. The Tory-IC test in May 1964 operated at full power for 5 minutes, demonstrating that a nuclear ramjet was physically achievable. The engine produced approximately 513 megawatts of thermal power while operating. The weapon as designed had a characteristic that its own designers acknowledged was specific to it and not shared by any other weapon system. It could not be safely tested, stored, or recovered without producing significant radioactive contamination. The exhaust from the nuclear ramjet was unshielded reactor effluent. The air passing through the reactor core and heating it also picked up radioactive products from the core and exhausted them continuously. A low-altitude nuclear ramjet flying across populated territory would have deposited radioactive material across its entire flight path. The program was canceled in 1964, with concerns about the absence of any safe method to test the complete weapon system at full operation being among the factors cited. Story 31, Operation Dark Winter. The government ran a bioterrorism simulation, and the results were horrifying. Operation Dark Winter was a senior-level government exercise conducted in June 2001, organized by the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Analytic Services Institute, involving former senior government officials playing the roles of National Security Council members, responding to a simulated covert smallpox attack on the United States. The exercise's scenario: a covert release of smallpox in 3 American shopping malls, Oklahoma City, Atlanta, and Philadelphia, with the initial cases presenting approximately 2 weeks after exposure, a timeline consistent with smallpox's incubation period. The simulation ran for 13 simulated days of crisis response. The findings that the exercise documented were systematic and alarming. The U.S. vaccine stockpile in 2001 was wholly inadequate to respond to a widespread smallpox outbreak. Approximately 15 million doses of vaccine existed at the time, against a population of approximately 285 million. And the exercise revealed that the production and distribution infrastructure for emergency vaccination at scale had been allowed to atrophy since routine smallpox vaccination ended in 1972. State and local health systems lacked the surge capacity, communications infrastructure, and legal frameworks to implement the kind of mass vaccination campaigns that outbreak control required. Interstate and federal coordination broke down under the simulated crisis conditions in ways that suggested the real-world consequences of a real attack would be considerably worse than any optimistic scenario suggested. The exercise was conducted in June 2001. The September 11 attacks occurred 3 months later, followed by the anthrax letter attacks in October 2001. The vulnerabilities Operation Dark Winter identified became suddenly and urgently relevant. Story 32, the Flying Pancake, the round aircraft that could take off from a battleship's deck, the Vought V-173, built and flown in 1942, was a full-scale proof of concept aircraft for a design approach that exploited specific aerodynamic properties of low aspect ratio circular and nearly circular wing planforms, properties that could, in theory, allow an aircraft to achieve takeoff at extremely low speeds and land with similar control at speeds low enough to be compatible with operation from naval vessels without catapult assistance. The circular wing's aerodynamic properties are genuinely different from conventional high aspect ratio wings. At very low speeds, the circular planform generates lift across its entire upper surface through strong vortex structures that form at the wing's leading edge and tips simultaneously, in a way that conventional long, narrow wings don't. This allows flight at airspeeds considerably lower than a conventional aircraft of similar power, which is what makes the very short takeoff roll and low landing speed possible. The V-173 actually flew. Test pilot Boone Guyton flew it for 190 hours over approximately 2 years and demonstrated the basic aerodynamic principle. The aircraft's unusual appearance generated significant public attention and reportedly prompted numerous UFO reports from members of the public who observed it during test flights over Connecticut. The engineering challenges that ultimately ended the program involved the mechanical complexity of the propeller gearbox arrangements required to drive the large diameter propellers that the circular wing's airflow requirements demanded. The gear reduction systems needed to prevent the propellers from exceeding supersonic tip speeds produced significant vibration that proved difficult to resolve within the available engineering resources and timelines of the wartime program. Story 33, Operation High Jump. The Navy sent 4,700 men and 13 ships to Antarctica and left after 8 weeks. Operation High Jump, launched in 1946 under the command of Admiral Richard Byard, was the largest U.S. military expedition to Antarctica ever conducted. 4,700 naval personnel, 13 ships including an aircraft carrier and multiple support vessels, 23 aircraft, and equipment for an extended polar operation. The official purposes were to train personnel in polar operations, test equipment in extreme cold weather, consolidate U.S. territorial claims in Antarctica, and conduct aerial reconnaissance and mapping of the continent. The expedition ended approximately 8 weeks into what had been planned as a longer operation, with the official explanation citing hazardous weather conditions and the end of the Antarctic summer season as making continued operations impractical. The early departure, the scale of the expedition relative to its stated purposes, and Admiral Byard's subsequent statements, including an interview in which he spoke of the importance of being prepared for adversaries capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, generated conspiracy theories that have persisted for decades. Theories range from the encounter with German remnant forces supposedly hidden in Antarctica, to UFO encounters, to hidden tunnel systems, to advanced technology testing. The mundane explanations for the early departure are also available. Polar operations in the 1940s were genuinely dangerous and logistically challenging. The Antarctic weather in the late summer can be severe, and an 8-week expedition covering thousands of miles of aerial survey in difficult conditions is not inherently suspicious. The expedition produced significant scientific and mapping data. Whether anything other than weather, ice, and the end of the operational season caused the early departure is unknown. The conspiracy theories fill the gap that incomplete records and an early departure create.